Hi, this is Ben Bufana. Some of my earliest memories revolve sitting in front of the television set at the age of 3. My mom would have television on to keep me entertained, but when they would have these cowboy and Indian movies on, in those days, the Indians were usually the bad guys. And when they were being killed off, I would be screaming and throwing fits. I found that so disturbing at the time. For some reason, I just felt this strong identification with the native people. And this identification and fascination continued to grow over the years. So as I grew older, I began to read all these books. My mom at the time was getting her or completing her degree in accounting at a university in Texas. And there was a university library that had all this amazing selection of books that, written but 1850s through 1900s, 1920 or so. And people who had lived among the tribes who had recorded accounts from the native people. And I just spent hours just reading, just completely absorbed. There also was a sizable native community in Texas at that time. Many would come down from Oklahoma, New Mexico, Kansas in search of employment. And they ended up making their home in Texas. So I would go to the powwows and other events, and I became friends with a lot of the native people in the community there. I began to hear about the traditional doctors around the time I was 14, and I was so fascinated by the accounts of these individuals basically lived with the foot in two worlds. They would go through these intensive practices such as the vision quest, and during the vision quest often various forces or beings would come to them, and they would receive these gifts of healing or develop other kinds of powers. Some had gifts that would enable them to bring the rain or that would protect them in battle. And at the age of 14, I decided, if ever given the opportunity, this is what I'll do with my life. I didn't know that it would ever come to pass, but I felt so deeply within myself that this is the direction I want to move in. I started saving money. And by the time I was 17, I had bought a car and had $900 cash. I took off to Oklahoma. Actually, my intention was to go to Arizona, thinking I would get in boarding school. That would keep me out of trouble. And yet my car only made it as far as Oklahoma, which turned out to be a very good thing because I felt a much stronger resonance with people among the Kiowa tribe. One of my young friends at the time introduced me to his adoptive father, who had the role of president of Kiowa chapter in the Native American Church. My friend, talking to his father, says, "Hey Dad, Ben wants to go into the Peyote meetings." So, from that time I began to attend meetings with the Native elders. And I remember at one point I was introduced to this older man who turns out he was the last surviving traditional doctor. And Horace didn't really say very much at that time. He was usually very quiet, introspective after the meetings. But about a year later, Horace was to work on the grandson of this older man who first took me into the Peyote meetings. And this was the first time I was ever to go to what was called a doctoring meeting. I remember that night, Horace was across the hallway in another bedroom. He was speaking to this older man, and I was talking with my young friend, and I was terrified at the time that Horace would say, well, this is only for Native people. You're not allowed to come in here. But he, at one point, he just stopped and began to stare at me as if he knew something. His gaze was very piercing, and it sent chills through me. And as nightfall came, the sun began to go down. We were lined up outside the teepee, and then we're walking around the teepee clockwise, and then we go in and we take our seats. And I was so relieved the fact that I had made it in the door. At some point during the night, Horace actually began to engage with me, telling me that he was thankful that I had come in that night. I think he did sense something. He was just trying to make contact. This is the first time that I'd ever had an opportunity to watch a Native doctor. And it was so amazing to see him. He actually took a piece of light charcoal out of the fire. He had placed a black handkerchief over the body of the patient, and he takes this piece of charcoal, puts it into his mouth, and he's blowing. And he's staring into this handkerchief, and he's looking into the body. That was his way of determining, actually observing what was going on within the patient. And then at some point, he actually has a live mole come up out of the ground into his hands. He sets this mole on the body of the patient, and this mole is somehow, has this kind of power and is working to facilitate the healing of the patient there. At that time, I was attending college. It was my first year. So I went on back, to school after there's that meeting and 2 nights later. But about a year later, my grades were starting to go down. It's like I realized I wasn't doing what I really needed to be doing with my life. And so I was talking with a friend, and with his encouragement, I decided that I would go ahead and approach Horace. Horace was staying at a cousin's house when he would come into Oklahoma at that time. So I stopped by the cousin's house, and he came out, and he was sitting in my car, and I was physically shaking. And somehow I managed to get the words out. I said, I want to learn to do the work you're doing. Horace didn't say yes or no. He just asked me, what are you doing this weekend? Can you start fasting? Still shaking, I just say, yeah, sure. And so I drive down to the Wichita Mountains, and I'm sitting there in my car for about 2 days and nights, not eating, not drinking. I'm not sure that much of anything really happened during that time. It was just Horace's way of determining if I was really serious. So he had me show up 2 days later. And at that time, he gave me the instructions when I finished my semester to come on out to New Mexico, and I would begin my training with him. And I did. 2 months later, I made my way to the Navajo Indian Reservation. Training with Horace is very intensive. From the beginning, he had me go with him when he went to treat patients in different parts of the reservation. And one of the first times I saw him work out there, it was a man there was a lot of sorcery among some of the southwestern tribes. And on that occasion, Horace began to spread charcoal from a fire across the ground. And he squatted down. He was there for a moment looking into the charcoal. And he began to describe the features of an individual. And the man who had called upon Horace for assistance said, oh, okay, that's my wife's cousin. And Horace says, yeah, okay, I know what to do here. Other times, we'd work with people, and somebody who maybe they were injured in an accident, or if they had some type of respiratory issues, whatever. And Horace would do things, for instance, like if the person had pneumonia, he would actually use suction and begin to draw the fluid out of the person's lungs. The training with Horace was so intensive. He would have me go out for periods of time without food and water. Traditionally the vision quest involves going for 4 days and nights alone in the mountains. And during the vision quest, Horace would have me come down to a certain point, and he would do these intensified versions where he would take me in the sweat lodge. And in addition, he would take portions of his own gifts or powers. Horace, like many of the other native doctors, possessed paranormal abilities. And so he would actually take a black handkerchief, throw it over my head, and he would push into the carotid arteries, and he would be looking into me, and he would be looking to determine, to get a sense of where I was, and at some point he would take like the end of a feather, for instance, and he'd be holding this handkerchief up. He'd push the end of this feather into a crease between his lips, and then he would project it out, and I'd feel this tremendous force impacting me. At the time he would do this, it would feel like going into a mini epileptic seizure. And this was his way, the way that many of these old traditional doctors transferred portions of their power. And then again, we'd be in the sweat, and he'd have me go back out for the time, sitting there alone. And then over time, he gradually had me helping to assist, as he would work with various individuals. One of the first times, he had me assist him doing the suction, and I remember the blood clots coming out of the back of this man's leg. The man had been injured in a construction accident. And I was so shocked, the fact that it was actually working, that maybe I did receive something. So I spent about 3 years with Horace. In addition to training with him, there were so many aspects of the training. He would have me in the sweat lodge much of the time. Wherever we went, he had me building the sweats, and he'd be conducting them. And he would actually take the lava rocks, which was his preferred rock, to use to heat the sweat lodge, because they didn't tend to break apart so readily. He would take them and he would actually handle them, and he'd be like transferring that power into the body of this patient. At other times he would actually invoke the spirit of the buffalo, and you could feel this presence of the buffalo itself crowding into the sweat lodge. And it was amazing, to watch him work. And there were times where, somebody had this, their leg would be swollen, this open wound, and he would actually take the swelling down and be, I remember this one occasion, he actually left the wound open partially so that more of the infection would drain out, and then he went back to work with the person later on. He would often work with the person in stages. In addition to being able to watch and assist Horace, he had me go through all kinds of intensive survival training. At one point, he dumped me off in the middle of the Hopi Indian reservation. He'd given me $30, and he sent me on my way to Las Vegas, Nevada, basically to learn to survive. He wanted me to learn to use my instincts. So as he's dropping me off, he's looking at me and says, "Make it the best you can. I'll come after you in a couple of months." So, he turns and drives off, and it was up to me to hitchhike to Las Vegas. And there's, being out here, there's bugs flying and crawling around, so that's what you're seeing going across the screen occasionally. But in any case, after a few months' time, Horace shows up to, he says, "Are you ready to go?" And I immediately just packed everything I had and was back in the truck, and we were heading across country again. So Horace to this day is, still is the most gifted and powerful healer that I have ever come across. Horace, though, did not really understand how to deal with his own emotions, his own interpersonal issues. As gifted and as powerful as he was, that was his, where he was lacking. And having this kind of power, the power itself is impartial, and that it's going to filter through. The body is like the lens, the body, the mind, the psyche, and the power filters through whatever it comes into contact with. And so, towards the end of that 3 years, things began to get pretty rough there. It's like there was a string of miracles on one hand, and then there's absolute chaos on the other. So, I could see Horace becoming destructive with his power. And I was only, in my early 20s at the time. I didn't quite know what to do about it. I confronted him at one point, but, he wasn't going to listen to what I had to say. And at one point, things were becoming so bad that I had to sever contact and just go off on my own. I realized at the point that I'd gone as far as I could with them. And it was heartbreaking for me. I found it devastating. I really didn't know what to do. Now, this same kind of phenomena is so prevalent. I've seen this among some of the gurus from India, some of the Tibetan lamas, people of other ancient spiritual traditions. And it's because many people who go into these disciplines, it's like as they feel they're exempt, from dealing with the human interpersonal, the emotional component. But the emotional itself is like a whole bandwidth of our psyche, of our consciousness. And if we try to jump over that, we're going to get into lots of trouble. The average person, what will happen is, whatever stress, whatever pain they've internalized, parts of their consciousness will just shut down. Maybe they'll act it out, through their addictions, or they'll abuse their partner, or some other means. But when you have someone that has this kind of intensive power, the destruction can be much greater. That was, a big part of the motivation of learning to work with my own feelings and emotions. And I teach other people how to do that. So that when we have various issues, various conflicts come up, and that's evoking some kind of difficult or painful feelings, that's where I tell people, to be fully present, to open up to what you feel, to breathe softly and deeply. And in doing so, it facilitates this digestive process. And as a result, that helps you to develop a much greater, stronger foundation in order to handle this kind of spiritual power. Gradually, I began to work with people on my own. Horace was telling me at one point, he said, I cannot hold your hand and explain everything you need to do. I was terrified at first. I didn't know if I'd received anything, or if, what had really taken place. And so, but as I was telling friends at the time when I was in college, I put myself back in college for 2 years after things came apart with Horace, because I needed that time to put myself back together. So the friends I talked with, they had asked me, at times, can you help me with this? Can you help me with that? It's like, well, let's see, I'll try. And so I began to work with them, and they would be describing, all these experiences they were having, of feeling this tremendous force come into the room, feeling the changes taking place within their own body. Some individuals said they could see or feel another presence around me. Like I would be in one, maybe down at the person's feet, and they would feel like other sets of hands working on the body at some point, or they would feel hands going into the body, in a sense, performing surgery. And I was equally amazed, to hear these accounts. It's like, I realized that, okay, I guess I really did receive something. And over time, there are periods where I felt very lost. I didn't quite know what to do, because Horace was the last surviving of the native doctors among the Kiowa tribe. But around the time I turned 30, I had this sense that I needed to be going back to the mountain. Like the other native doctors, going out for the 4 days and nights without the food and water. And each time I've gone, various forces or beings would come to me, and I would feel this presence come into my body. Parts of the vision quest would be like a near-death experience. And the feelings, the impressions of different experiences or events that had taken place in my life, things that had hurt me or that had impacted me in some kind of adverse way, all this would be coming up, and I'd be going through this intensive digestive process. It'd be like a dream-like state on one hand, but I'd be like thoroughly digesting everything that had happened along the way. And this was helping me to build a much greater, stronger foundation. And plus, integrating this practice that I described of just working with the feelings, the emotions as they'd come up, I began to breathe into them. And gradually I became stronger. I began to learn over time to develop an understanding of the human body and mind. People would be coming to me with all kinds of different conditions. I didn't really know much of anything to begin with, but as I continued working with people, I began to develop a range of expertise and working with assisting people with anything from digestive, respiratory, neurological disorders, people who had suffered from all kinds of adverse or traumatic experiences, who were struggling with depression, anxiety. And even to this day, and for as long as I live, it's a continued process of learning and growth for me. So again, this has been Rufana. Be sure to check out my website. The details are below. If you need to reach out to me, feel free to do so. Contact information is on my website. I look forward to being of assistance to you.